As someone who didn't grow up during the heights of the arcades, my minimal exposure to SNK came from their positioning opposite the Versus to Capcom. The Capcom vs SNK series codified a long-standing rivalry for arcade dominance into a begrudging frenemy showdown that acted as a swan song for the then dying arcades at the turn of the millennium. But despite what their equal prominence in the title might suggest, these two companies were not fighting on equal footing. Failure to pivot to a decreasingly arcade world, a poor 64-bit arcade system, and a variety of other factors too numerous to list, ended in SNK filing for bankruptcy and then closing its doors by the end of 2001. The company's IPs exchanged hands a few times thereafter, and following a few rebrands, a version of SNK does exist today. But for all intents and purposes, the closing of the original in 2001 marks the end of an era. For an entire generation, SNK's whole existence was practically defined by their trading of blows with Capcom. When 1991's happy accident that was Street Fighter II ended up creating a brand new fast-paced combo-centric genre, it was less than a year later before SNK responded with Fatal Fury. And I think that's part of why this series we're talking about today is still a meaningful play. It doesn't chase the era's popular trends, it maybe even outright rejects them. It's slow, deliberate, and dare I say, elegant. It has its own voice in the fighting game landscape, and that voice is the sound of steel meeting steel. Samurai Shodown hit the stage in 1993, and it's almost unbelievable how much of it they got right on the first go, and with such a high bar for presentation. It's a traditional 6-button 2D fighting game, but the primary differentiator here is weapon-based combat. Our around-the-world roster of 10 characters each wields some culturally iconic pointy stick. But this differentiator is importantly not just a stylistic one, but instead a central design pillar that informs the rest of the game's mechanics. Because Samurai Shodown is a playable PSA that weapons are dangerous. In contrast to the fisticuffs-focused design of its peers, Shodown has longer ranges, bigger hitboxes, further knockback, and higher damage, all of which result in a playstyle that discourages getting in your opponent's face and instead prefers you dance around their max range and find hits strategically. You're not going to get off ridiculous combos here, but the flip side to that is that the individual strikes you do land can be very punishing. A well-timed heavy slash can remove a third of your opponent's health with ease. The importance of weapons also reinforces just how frail you are when they're lost. Disarming can happen after a clash gone south or spent as a resource for some character's strongest moves. Losing your weapon and needing to pick it back up off the ground leaves you vulnerable and with a weaker, lower range moveset of punches until you can get it back. Accountability is a core gameplay theme here, and at any time you're only 2 to 3 bad inputs away from a decisive death. It's surely not the only fighting game where this is true, but at least one of the only ones I've played where it's profoundly obvious even at the lowest levels of play, unobfuscated by the high skill floor demanded from faster paced fighters. Even down to the minute details, from the officiator judging our fight in the background, to the fact that hit percentage is a contributor to your high score, Samurai Shodown reinforces that every hit landed is a battle won. And thankfully for us, Samurai Shodown consumed enough coins that a sequel was in order. 1994's Samurai Shodown II is the fan favorite of the series, and I think a lot of that has to do with how delicate its hand is. Because Samurai Shodown II plays almost exactly like its predecessor with some very subtle gameplay tweaks, most important of which is the POW meter, which was there in Game 1 as well, but can now actually be weaponized as a super move enabler instead of just the passive stat buff it was before. Other gameplay additions center largely on movement. Short hops are now an option to get you over low swings without the punishing air time of a regular jump. Rolls give you a way to maneuver into longer range fighters better but leave you vulnerable on the way in, and you can duck now. It's a trio of additions that are timeless gameplay improvements, and though a minority of contemporary reviews criticize this sequel for being a very small leap forward, that's also what assured it was an uncontroversial success. The roster expanded to 4 additional characters, notable of which is Genjiro, acting as the Ken to Haomaru's Ryu, and their former mentor Nicotine. I played a ton of Genjiro, both because I love his heavy, brutal fighting style, but also because I love this thematic inversion of the protagonist energy he brings. Out of all the characters in the roster, Genjiro is the only one whose stance ensures his back is always facing you, both to show his disdain for the player, and ensure his wicked backscar is always in full view. He is cool. But equally important to Samurai Shodown II are some of the intangibles. The game is filled with tons of little Easter eggs. Secret bosses, secret inputs, and other mysteries to spread around an arcade gave Samurai Shodown II an almost communal appeal. Maybe that's why this entry did disproportionately well in the arcades compared to the home console version. It was riding the high of the mid-90s renaissance of the arcades thanks to fighting games, and was a strong enough title to contend with others doing the same. For a small while, it was even able to spin itself into a multimedia attraction, or at least it tried to. Movies, merchandise, in-game references to that merchandise. They didn't penetrate the culture long enough to become a true long-term icon, but for this small period in 1994, it's clear that Samurai Shodown II marked the apex of critical reception, commercial success, and arguably game design. Unfortunately for its successor, there's only one place to go from the top. Samurai Shodown III is a soft reboot of the series. Where 2 is comfortable bringing in old assets and gameplay, 3 reworks almost everything from the ground up. And the most immediate change you'll see even before hitting the gameplay is the new darker tone. New sprites for every character emphasize shadows, goofier characters from previous entries have been redesigned to be more serious, and characters that were too goofy are just gone entirely, replaced by a new fighter that probably has a higher respect for the intensity of the blade. Music and stage lighting will shift as one or both parties near death, emphasizing the finality to these life and death struggles. Even the judge in the background tracking every hit is gone. Blood is in the subtitle for this one because it is serious. And you know what? This is kind of cool. For all of Samurai Shodown 3's vices, I don't think presentation is among them, and the more intense mood matches the respect for violence and weaponry that the gameplay has always had. No, I think Samurai Shodown 3's cardinal sin isn't something you can see with your eyes, it's something you feel while playing, the higher speed. Characters move faster, attack faster, and are open to less punish time after block. It's quicker, and that's not just because of control changes, but a new option that precedes every duel. Each character can select a slash or bust mode, which roughly correlates to a defensive and offensive playstyle respectively. Movesets are slightly modified to account for this, and the need for this bust set of tools ensures that every character on the roster effectively has a fast mode. Even if you don't use it, your opponents will. That's not the only input you're making before the match either. Stance selection will change meter management and blocking rules depending on whether you go low, medium, or high. It adds another layer of decision making, but I'm not exactly sure that was a layer I needed or wanted. A lot of the extra movement Samurai Shodown II introduces gets unified into a single contextual dodge button. That, when used up close, also doubles as this swirly flanking move that feels more like a tech demo for SNK's sprite scaling tech than a meaningful gameplay inclusion. That's not to say that every touch this third entry makes to the gameplay is a bad one. I particularly enjoy how the 3 kick strengths are now consolidated into a single kick button. It's just that I'm not a fan of all the other things those 3 buttons are doing. But Samurai Shodown 3 isn't a bad game, it's just a different one, albeit one I don't think fits the gameplay of the rest of the series. For better or worse, you can't accuse it of being Samurai Shodown 2.5. I'm not going to say it's a worse game because the judge in the background lost his job, but rather it's his absence that clues us into the greater problem. His inability to keep up without looking like a janky high-speed mess says more about the gameplay than it does him. Samurai Shodown IV understands this, and is practically a playable apology from SNK. It doesn't pretend 3 never happened, but instead takes a firm look at what worked and what didn't, and isn't afraid to cherry-pick accordingly. Simplified kicking options? Kept. Weird twirly flank button? Still here, just a bit less ridiculous. Dynamic stage backgrounds that respond to player health? Kept. Slash and bust modes? Actually, these were kept too, but importantly, both of them have had their speeds reduced since the last entry. If it's not obvious while watching, it is obvious while playing, and jumping into 4 immediately after playing 3 had my fingers moving over the controller way faster than my characters were keeping up. It took a game or two of re-education to remind myself of the slower pace that this series has almost always had, and that's arguably the biggest change in 4. This game also introduces the honorable death mechanic, allowing you to forfeit a round to start the following with a full POW bar. It's a subtle risk-reward mechanic that pushes your opponent closer to victory, but hopefully gives you the tools you need to swing that back, and it's thematically cool as hell too. But when it comes to revisiting these games as a series and playing them as part of a collection, I think 4's biggest problem is standing out. For me, and I think many others, Samurai Shodown IV is an entry that I like but don't love. It doesn't have the novelty of being the first, the quality of being the second, the uniqueness of being the black sheep, or the refinement of being the most recent. And that most recent is 2003's Samurai Shodown V, the last Shodown to grace the NeoGeo, and that year tells a story. This title was released under the reformed SNK Playmore that rose from the ashes of old SNK. Why the 7-year gap from 4? Well, keep in mind that in the late 90s, SNK tried and failed to transition their arcade hardware to the third dimension, and that means transitioning their software too. 2 failed Samurai Shodown games released for the arcade-exclusive Hyper NeoGeo 64, and by the time 5 released, it was already a retro throwback. The heights of the arcades were in the past even 2 decades ago, and the NeoGeo hardware it was releasing for was already 13 years old at that point. 13 years at a time when the industry and its tech were rapidly evolving. That 13 years may as well be a lifetime, and from a purely technical level, comparing Samurai Shodown V to nearly anything Capcom was doing around the same time feels criminal. That's probably why 5 was only a mild success. It couldn't impress graphically in this new millennium where audiences were yearning to see what the next generation of graphical hardware could deliver, so it had to get the fundamentals right. And I think it did. If you can look past the fact that this is the second game in a row where the series needed to return to its roots, it's up to you whether or not you think it succeeded. Slash and bust are finally gone, but the overall speed of the game feels a notch or 2 up from 4 again. We get another round of redone controls, but perhaps most importantly is the amount of post-launch tinkering 5 has gotten compared to its peers. A year later, Samurai Shodown V Special was released to introduce some graphical fixes, visual tweaks, and balance changes, but also introduced what might be 5's most iconic feature, an insta-kill option that can be unleashed under the perfect circumstances. In an attempt to give the NeoGeo a final Samurai Shodown game it could be proud of, the developers were hard at work on Samurai Shodown V Perfect, an updated re-release of the special edition with further tweaks. It ended up getting cancelled and never saw the light of day until 2020 when the NeoGeo re-release package hit digital storefronts. You can't go wrong with Special or Perfect, though this 5th entry in the series does dramatically increase the anime. To fill out this significantly sized roster, we're really bending the rules on what a weapon is. And there's at least a few fighters in here who look like they can go toe-to-toe with Goku. It's got a tremendous amount of content, but for me, my heart still lies with the simplicity found from the first 2 entries. Because playing this collection of Samurai Shodown has brought me further into fighting games than any other series has done before. I've always been fighting game curious, or fighting game adjacent, interested in fighting games and their long history and wide depth, but unable to invest the time needed to get over the skill floor before having a truly entertaining time. I've been waiting for the right fighting game for me to come out, one that's slow and focused more on strategy than execution, de-emphasizing complexity and inputs, yet still delivering the thrill of a good kill. Who knew that this hypothetical fighting game of my dreams was released 3 decades ago, with artwork and gameplay that haven't aged a day? It was a better entry point to the genre for me than any other game that has you fighting on the streets. And no matter which one you play, it's only minutes until you can achieve the joyous laughter that's impossible to keep inside on a clean finisher. Today it's not the most recognizable IP. Its reboot didn't exactly set the world on fire, and it's uncertain what its future holds. But playing these titles for the first time in 2022 has me invigorated and yearning for more. They're not flashy or exciting by today's standards, but they are simple, refined, and elegant. If that's not in the samurai spirit, I don't know what is.